when the Coast Guard called me at midnight, asking why my boat, the Lucky Escape, was cruising 5 miles offshore with a dozen drunk people dancing on deck. I thought it was a prank. "I'm sorry, what?" I asked, sitting up in bed, still jet-lagged after flying back from a week-long work trip in Seattle. "Sir," the officer said, "your registered vessel was just boarded. There are no life vests, unlicensed alcohol distribution, and no one on board has a boating license. We need you to come down to the marina immediately." I threw on jeans and grabbed my keys, my heart pounding like a war drum. My boat. I had locked her up tight before leaving. She was docked at my private slip behind a coded gate. No one should have gotten near her. By the time I got to the marina, the Lucky Escape was tied up at the dock, flashing red and blue lights painting her white hull. Uniformed officers were still questioning a group of partygoers in dresses and polo shirts, people I didn't recognize. And then I saw her. Standing stiffly, arms crossed, platinum blonde bob backlit by the deck lights, Olivia Cartrite, HOA president of the Windward Palms Residential Association. Mid-50s, permanently sour expression, and the self-appointed god of our waterfront community. I walked up to the officers. "That's my boat, Frederick Taylor. I didn't authorize any of this." One officer raised an eyebrow. "You know her," he gestured at Olivia, who was now pretending not to see me. "She's the head of our HOA," I said. "What the hell is going on here?" The officer sighed and pointed to a clipboard. They claimed they had permission. Said the HOA controlled the dock properties and could authorize recreational use for community events. I stared at him, stunned. That's not even remotely true. The moment Olivia noticed I wasn't going away, she finally walked over, lips pursed like she'd just sucked on a lemon. "Frederick," she said, voice dripping with fake concern. "We had to host the Windward Summer Gala somewhere since the clubhouse renovations weren't finished yet. Your boat was the most presentable option. You weren't using it. You broke into it." She waved her manicured hand. "Technically, the HOA has access rights to all shared dock resources." I laughed. "That dock isn't shared. It's deeded to my property. You know that." "Well," she snapped, "maybe that's something the association should revisit." "In the meantime, you're being unreasonable." "Unreasonable," I said, stepping closer. "You trespassed, threw a party with God knows what kind of liability, and now the Coast Guard's involved. Which wouldn't have happened if you kept your boat fully compliant," she snapped back. The officer stepped between us. "Ma'am, you're not helping your case." Olivia's face paled. For the first time, she looked rattled. One of the Coast Guard officers walked over and whispered something to the lead investigator, who turned back to me. "We'll need to take an official statement, Mr. Taylor. If you'd like to press charges for unauthorized use of your vessel, now's the time." I looked at Olivia. Her jaw was clenched, but her eyes were darting everywhere, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "Oh, I'm pressing charges," I said. "And I'm not stopping there." By morning, I'd already spoken to a maritime lawyer, filed a police report for grand theft, and handed over surveillance footage from a motion-activated dock camera I'd installed 6 months earlier, footage that showed Olivia unlocking the dock gate using a master key she had no legal right to possess, waving in a catering crew, and directing them aboard the Lucky Escape like she owned it. The footage also captured her slipping what looked like envelopes to 2 of the guests, one of whom was the association treasurer, Douglas Wright. That wasn't just trespassing. That was conspiracy. Detective Mara Klein from the county's Property Crimes Division met me at the precinct later that afternoon. Her tone was calm but clipped, the kind of voice that meant she'd seen enough HOA nonsense to know when something stunk. "Mr. Taylor," she said, clicking a pen, "we verified the deeded property lines. That dock is indisputably yours. The association has no rights over it, nor your vessel. Based on the footage you provided and the Coast Guard's report, we're preparing to submit charges for unlawful entry, misappropriation of private property, and possible insurance fraud." "Insurance fraud?" I asked. Klein tapped her notepad. "You mentioned a security system on board." Did it alert you to the unauthorized access? It's connected to my home Wi-Fi. I disabled notifications while I was out of town to avoid roaming fees. Why? She leaned forward. Because the system was tampered with. The security module was powered off manually from inside the cabin. That's no accident, and if your boat sustained any damage during the event, it did. The galley cabinet was ripped out, there's wine stains in the upholstery, and someone cracked the helm screen. Then they're liable for damages. And if any repairs are claimed through your insurance without disclosure of the unauthorized use, that's insurance fraud. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice level. So what happens next? We're serving a warrant at the HOA office. If what we suspect is true, she didn't act alone. This wasn't some spontaneous party, this was coordinated. By the time I left the station, word had already spread. A neighbor named Linda, who lived 3 doors down and had always been polite if distant, waved me over as I pulled into my driveway. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, glancing nervously up the street. "But I thought you should know. I overheard Olivia talking to Douglas last week. She mentioned something about putting the boat to community use and how nobody would care if it was just one night. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Would you be willing to say that officially?" She hesitated. I think so, yes, if it helps," I nodded. "It helps. A lot." While I gave her Detective Klein's contact info, a white Nissan with the HOA logo on the side rolled slowly past my house, barely crawling. The driver was Janice, Olivia's little lieutenant, the one who once wrote me up for inappropriate flag placement because my American flag was at a slight angle during a windstorm. She met my eyes through the windshield, then drove on without stopping. The show of intimidation was pathetic, but not unexpected. That night, I went over every clause of the HOA bylaws line by line. I'd never paid them much mind before, like most residents. I paid my dues and stayed off their radar. But now I dug into every paragraph like I was back in law school. And that's when I found it. Appendix D, Section 9. No member of the board shall engage in use of privately owned property for community purposes without written consent from said owner, regardless of physical proximity or perceived common benefit. Violation of this clause is grounds for immediate removal from office pending a vote by quorum. I wasn't just going to press charges, I was going to remove her. The next morning, I called for a special meeting of the HOA. According to the bylaws, any homeowner could do so with a petition signed by at least 10% of residents. I had 20 signatures by noon. Not everyone liked Olivia. Most tolerated her because she kept the landscaping tidy and the clubhouse stocked with coffee pods. But after word got out that she'd hijacked a neighbor's boat for a private party, even the fence sitters wanted her gone. By late afternoon, a county patrol car was parked outside the HOA office. Detective Klein and another officer emerged with a file box and a laptop. Olivia wasn't there. According to the officers, she'd left town that morning something about a wellness retreat in Arizona. Coward. That didn't stop the process. Detective Klein confirmed they'd found emails between Olivia and Douglas discussing creative use of idle resident assets and how to frame the event as a sanctioned gathering to minimize liability. In one email, Douglas asked, "What if he finds out?" Olivia replied, "Then we spin it as a misunderstanding." He's reasonable. I had that printed out and ready. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening in the community center. By then, the whispers had turned into full-blown outrage. Several residents reported finding leftover garbage from the party in their trash bins. Olivia had apparently ordered cleanup crews to distribute the waste off-site, so it wouldn't be traced back. When I stepped into the meeting hall, it was standing room only. Folding chairs had been dragged from storage, and even then, people were leaning against walls with arms crossed. Douglas sat near the front, pale and sweating. He'd been summoned by the detective earlier that day and clearly knew the walls were closing in. I walked to the podium. unrolling the petition and placing it in front of the secretary. My name is Frederick Taylor. I'm the legal owner of 14 Windward Bay and the private dock adjacent to it. As of Tuesday evening, my property was unlawfully accessed by members of this board and used without my permission for a private event. I've filed charges with the county sheriff's office and have provided evidence to support those claims. Murmurs rippled through the room. I held up the printed email from Olivia. This was sent from the HOA server. It proves premeditation. There was no misunderstanding. The murmurs turned into gasps. One man in the back actually shouted, "She used our dues for this." "Yes," I said, "and worse. The bylaws are clear." Section 9 of Appendix D states that any board member who uses private property without consent is subject to immediate removal. I've met the petition requirement. I'm calling for a vote. Douglas tried to object, but the secretary, an older woman named Ruth who'd been on the board for years, cut him off. "We'll vote now, one by one." It took 20 minutes. By the end, the tally was overwhelming: 64 in favor of removal, 2 opposed, 3 abstained. Ruth stood and addressed the crowd. By majority vote, Olivia Cartrite is hereby removed as president of the Windward Palms Residential Association effective immediately. Further leadership status is suspended pending legal resolution of any criminal proceedings. Applause thundered through the hall. Someone shouted, "About time," and others clapped harder. I didn't smile. I just gathered my papers and walked out into the night, the cool salt air brushing against my face like a reset button. Olivia hadn't faced the full consequences yet, but the cracks had formed, and I wasn't done widening them. 2 days after the emergency meeting, I was called back to the precinct not by Detective Klein this time, but by a federal investigator from the Department of Homeland Security. That raised my eyebrows. I arrived at the station expecting to clarify a few things about the boat incident. What I got instead was a broader picture and a hell of a lot more trouble than I thought Olivia Cartrite could possibly cause. Agent Rafael Mendoza met me in a quiet conference room, sleeves rolled up, lean frame and sharp eyes that scanned everything twice. "We've been monitoring irregularities tied to several coastal properties in this region," he began, sliding a file across the table. "Your HOA and its board president showed up on our radar last month." I opened the file. Inside were bank statements, association financial ledgers, and a scanned manifest of guests from the night of the incident. At the bottom of the guest list, 2 names were circled in red ink. "I don't recognize these," I said. "You wouldn't," Mendoza replied. "They're aliases connected to an interstate wire fraud operation. We believe Olivia was laundering funds through a shell nonprofit she registered under the name Windward Coastal Enrichment Fund." I blinked. "You're telling me the HOA was a front?" "Not entirely. Most members were probably unaware, but Cartrite and at least 3 others used the association's accounts to funnel money from fake community initiatives, dock maintenance, clubhouse expansion, landscaping upgrades, and redirect it into offshore trusts." I leaned back, stunned. "And the party cover," Mendoza said. "They used it to host 2 out-of-state buyers interested in acquiring waterfront property through forged deeds. The lucky escape was likely chosen because it offered a neutral space, no surveillance they knew about, no paper trail. They didn't know I had cameras on the dock," I muttered. Mendoza allowed himself a dry nod. "That footage fast-tracked our warrant." I looked back down at the file. "So what happens now?" "We've already detained Douglas Wright. He tried to board a flight to Panama yesterday morning. The other 2 board members involved Janice Leland and a man named Peter Malin have been subpoenaed. Olivia's still at large, but she's not in Arizona. She lied about the retreat. We traced her phone to a private airstrip outside Charleston. She's traveling under a passport issued to a shell identity. Once she crosses into certain jurisdictions, extradition becomes complicated." I exhaled slowly. "How much did they steal?" "Just under $3 million over 6 years. most of it siphoned from inflated contractor invoices and fake grant projects. They kept homeowners quiet with minor improvements and strict enforcement of petty rules. People stopped asking questions. I nodded grimly. Until she broke into the wrong boat. Mendoza cracked his knuckles. We're coordinating with the Attorney General's office. There'll be a federal complaint filed by the end of the week. In the meantime, we need your full cooperation. You'll have it. That evening, I returned home to find a crowd gathered by the marina gate. Someone had taped a printout of the news article to the HOA bulletin board. Local HOA president under federal investigation for fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Below it, someone had scribbled in permanent marker, "So much for the summer gala." I recognized a few of the neighbors, Linda from 2 doors down, the D'Angelos who'd mostly kept to themselves, and even Mr. Roth, a retired firefighter who once told me he didn't get involved with politics. Now he was holding a clipboard. "We're forming a transitional committee," he said as I approached. "Until the state appoints an external administrator. Thought you might want in." I hesitated. "I've got enough legal paperwork to swim in." "This isn't about paperwork," he said. "It's about getting our neighborhood back. You were the first one to stand up to them. That matters." I looked around. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were people who'd been lied to, manipulated, and ignored. And now they were ready to clean house. "All right," I said, "but I'm not touching landscaping decisions." That got a few laughs, a welcome break from the tension that had hung over Windward Palms for too long. 2 mornings later, I was summoned to testify before a grand jury. The hearing was held in a windowless room at the federal courthouse, where I answered questions about the boat incident, the HOA's financial practices, and the emails Detective Klein had uncovered. The prosecuting attorney, a steely woman named Marissa Duval, zeroed in on the Shell nonprofit. "Did you, at any point, receive communication from the Windward Coastal Enrichment Fund regarding donations or board decisions?" "No," I said. "I'd never even heard of it until last week." "Did you authorize any use of your property specifically, your vessel or dock for association events?" "No, never," she nodded, satisfied. Behind her, the jurors scribbled notes. Afterward, Mendoza met me outside the courtroom. "She's nailed," he said. "Not just for theft. We're adding charges for impersonation of a federal grant coordinator. Apparently, she forged a letter to secure a state subsidy for coastal education programs." "Let me guess," I said. "There are no programs." "None. Just a fake Shell website and some stock photos of kids holding fishing nets." I shook my head. "Unbelievable. Believe it." "She's not the first HOA president to go off the rails, but she's the first one I've seen try to launder money through a boat party." By the end of the week, Douglas had flipped. In his plea deal, he admitted to years of falsified invoices, including one for a non-existent seawall inspection that netted them $50,000 in one afternoon. In exchange for reduced sentencing, he gave up everything: Olivia's offshore contacts, her fake passport alias, even the name of the notary who'd helped them backdate forged signatures. That broke the case wide open. The state froze all HOA accounts. Contractors linked to the fraudulent invoices were blacklisted. The Windward Palms Association was placed under a temporary court conservatorship, and an independent forensic accountant began untangling the financial web Olivia had spun. Meanwhile, the Lucky Escape was in dry dock, undergoing repairs. The Coast Guard had cleared her of any further violations, but it would take weeks to restore her to pre-party condition. One of the guests had tried to drill holes into the hull to install a champagne cooler. Another had flushed plastic cups down the head, bursting a pipe. I paid for the repairs out of pocket, knowing I'd get reimbursed eventually. But I didn't care about the money anymore. It wasn't about restitution. It was about making sure the next person who thought they could take something just because they wore a badge labeled HOA thought twice. One evening, while reviewing statements for a civil suit against the remaining board members, I received a call from Mendoza. "We got her. Where? Grenada. She was trying to board a yacht registered under a fake company. Coast Guard flagged it. She'll be extradited within the week. I didn't say anything at first, just sat there staring at the wall of my study. Then I asked, was she alone? No. Her notary was with her. So was a man we believe helped fabricate the property deeds. I thanked him and hung up. The next neighborhood meeting was held under the new transitional committee. Gone were the catered spreads and pompous speeches. Now we had folding chairs, notepads, and open discussion. I stood up near the end. We've got a lot of rebuilding to do, I said. Not just docs and budgets, trust, accountability, community. We let one person turn this place into their personal empire because it was easier not to ask questions. That ends now. When I finished, no one clapped. They just nodded. That was better. Approval is easy. Agreement takes work. And after everything we'd been through, the people of Windward Palms were finally ready to work. On a quiet Wednesday morning, I walked into the county courthouse with a folder tucked beneath my arm labeled WPR Association Civil Action. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, windowless, with wood-paneled walls that hummed with the dull groan of overhead fluorescence. At the front, Judge Harlan Whitford sat behind the bench with an expression that suggested he'd already read too much HOA nonsense for one lifetime. Douglas Wright sat with his attorney at the defense table, thinner than I remembered, his hands folded tightly in his lap. His suit didn't quite fit, and his eyes avoided mine. The other two former board members, Janice and Peter, had opted for video appearances from their respective detainment locations, their feeds boxed in the corner of a wall-mounted screen. Olivia's seat was empty. Her extradition had been delayed by 2 days due to a diplomatic formality, but the judge had ruled the case would proceed in her absence. My attorney, a sharp former JAG officer named Tanya Riley, stood and launched into the opening statement. We intend to prove that the Windward Palms Residential Association, under the leadership of these individuals, knowingly exploited private property, misappropriated homeowner funds, and breached fiduciary duties for personal enrichment. We will also demonstrate that Mr. Taylor suffered material damages and reputational harm as a result of these unlawful actions. Judge Whitford didn't nod. He just scribbled something on a yellow legal pad and gestured for the first witness. We started with the marina's dock manager, who confirmed the association had no legal access to my slip or vessel. Then came the forensic accountant, who laid out a devastating timeline of money trails. Inflated invoices, kickbacks disguised as community grants, and contractor payments routed through a Nevada-based LLC that had no employees or equipment. But it wasn't until Linda took the stand that things shifted from scandal to something darker. They told us the clubhouse construction was over budget, she said, hands trembling slightly. That we needed to approve an emergency dues increase, but I never saw any permits filed. And when I asked about the contractor, I was told it was handled internally. Tanya asked her to clarify. Did handled internally mean the board was overseeing the work themselves? No, Linda said. It meant the contractor was Olivia's nephew. He doesn't even live in the state. He owns a landscaping business in Utah. I looked it up, the gallery murmured. Judge Whitford banged his gavel once. Tanya thanked Linda and called the next witness, a former HOA assistant named Rachel, barely out of college, who had quit 6 months earlier. They had me create fake meeting minutes, Rachel said, voice low but steady. Sometimes I'd be handed a list of decisions and told to make it sound like the community voted on them. I didn't know it was illegal at first. I was told it was common in private associations. The judge leaned forward. Did you ever witness signatures being forged? Rachel nodded. On 4 occasions. I saw Olivia sign names of members who were on vacation. She joked that if they didn't show up, they didn't get a say. Later that afternoon, Tanya called me to the stand. What was your first indication that something was wrong? She asked. The call from the Coast Guard, I said. I'd just gotten home from Seattle. They told me my boat was being used illegally by people I didn't know for a party I never authorized. She walked me through the footage, the damage, the repair costs. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. In your opinion, was this a one-time mistake? A simple misunderstanding? No, I said. This was calculated. They knew I was out of town. They accessed a locked dock, tampered with my equipment, and used the vessel to entertain buyers involved in a fraudulent real estate scheme. That's not a misunderstanding. That's organized theft. The defense attorney, a gray-haired man who looked like he'd been dragged in from a golf course, stood up for cross-examination. Mr. Taylor, would you agree that the HOA routinely hosts community events? Yes. And that those events are sometimes held in shared spaces. My dock isn't shared. According to maps filed in, those maps were filed after the bylaws were written. The deed is clear. It's not association property. The judge cleared his throat. Counselor, the property lines have been verified by 3 independent records. Let's not waste time. The attorney sat down, defeated. Tanya gave me a nod as I stepped down. The next day, the courtroom filled with reporters. News of the HOA scandal had gone statewide, and now the term Dockgate was trending on local radio. The prosecution introduced a new piece of evidence, a USB drive seized from Olivia's laptop. It contained dozens of audio recordings. She'd apparently kept voice memos of meetings, maybe to protect herself or maybe because she was arrogant enough to believe she'd never get caught. One recording made the entire room go silent. A distorted voice, Olivia said, "If we get pushback, we tell them it was a sanctioned event. If he sues, we tie him up in court until he gives up. Homeowners don't have the stomach for legal drama." Judge Whitford paused the playback and looked over his glasses. "Miss Riley, has this recording been authenticated?" "It has, Your Honor. The metadata matches the seized laptop." Admitted into evidence. By the end of the week, the civil case had unraveled into a full-blown federal prosecution. Olivia's charges now included wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and falsifying legal documents. The judge ordered immediate asset freezes on all 3 board members. Their bank accounts, vehicles, and secondary properties were seized under the RICO statute. Douglas's plea deal was formally rescinded. When it was revealed, he'd withheld the existence of a second shell company. On the final day of proceedings, the judge issued summary judgments in favor of the plaintiffs, myself, and a group of homeowners who had joined the civil action. The HOA was dissolved by court order, its remaining assets placed in a restitution fund to repay residents who had been defrauded over the years. As for my boat, the repairs were covered in full plus damages. But the real victory was structural. The county issued a new oversight mandate for all residential associations along the coast, requiring financial disclosures, annual audits, and rotating third-party compliance officers. Windward Palms would no longer be a private fiefdom. It would be a neighborhood again. Outside the courthouse, I stood beside Tanya watching news vans pack up. "You ever think something like this would happen?" she asked, arms crossed. "Honestly," I said, "I figured I'd get a letter about my garbage can being out 20 minutes too long." "Not a federal racketeering case," she laughed softly. "Well, thanks for dragging me into it. I'll be dining out on this story for years." A few weeks later, I hosted a small get-together, not a gala, not a fundraiser, just a barbecue with neighbors. No speeches, no votes. Just people who had been through hell together, finally breathing clean air. Mr. Roth brought ribs. Linda made her famous lemon bars. Even the D'Angelos, who'd once considered moving, stayed late into the evening, their kids chasing each other barefoot across the lawn. As the sun dipped low over the bay, I walked down the dock and stepped onto the Lucky Escape. Her deck was clean, the repairs flawless. She looked better than she had in years. I sat behind the helm, engine off, and let the silence settle. No more forced compliance. No more threats tucked in envelopes. No more strangers treating my property like a free ride. Just water, wind, and the sound of a neighborhood finally healing. Justice had taken its time, but it had arrived.